Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The memory of that Tuesday night is etched into the back of my eyelids, a permanent film reel that plays every time I close my eyes, and it began not with a sense of dread, but with the mundane annoyance of a sudden, total blackout. We were in my grandmother's old house, a creaky Victorian on the edge of town that smelled perpetually of dust and dried lavender, and the five of us, me, my girlfriend Chloe, her brother Mark, and our friends Liam and Sarah, had been watching some forgettable movie. When the screen died, the hum of the refrigerator ceased, and the world was plunged into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on my eardrums. "Well, this is just great," Mark groaned, his voice too loud in the new quiet, and fumbling ensued, the clatter of someone knocking over a beer bottle, followed by Sarah's nervous giggle as Chloe, ever practical, announced she knew where the candles were, her footsteps a confident tattoo on the hardwood floor heading towards the kitchen. I remember staring out the bay window into a blackness I'd never seen before, a pure, velvety absence of light that seemed to swallow the very concept of the neighborhood, of the world beyond the glass, and a small, cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach, a feeling I dismissed as childishness, the primal fear of the dark that never truly leaves us. When Chloe returned, her face a flickering mask of dancing shadows cast by the 3 candlesticks she carried, the mood shifted from annoyance to a kind of giddy, improvised adventure, the circle of warm light feeling both comforting and terribly fragile against the pressing void beyond. It was Liam, of course, who suggested it, his voice a low, theatrical rumble. "You know what this is perfect for? A proper Ouija board session. No fake lights, no distractions. Just us and the void." Sarah immediately protested, a genuine tremor in her voice. "Oh, come on, Liam. That's not funny. You know that stuff freaks me out." But Mark, always contrary, seized on the idea. "Why not?" "It's a piece of plastic, Sarah. It'll be a laugh." And Chloe, with a skeptical shrug, said, "I think there's one in the attic from when we were kids. A real vintage one." The decision felt insignificant at the time, a way to kill an hour until the power company did its job. But as Chloe went back into the swallowing darkness of the hallway to climb the creaking stairs to the attic, the silence of the house seemed to deepen, as if it were listening, and that cold knot in my stomach gave another twist. When she returned, she was holding a flat, rectangular box, its lid illustrated with a stylized sun and moon, the letters Ouija worn almost smooth by time, and as she blew dust off the lid, a cloud of it caught the candlelight, making the particles look like tiny, frantic stars. We cleared the coffee table, pushing aside remotes and snack bowls, and placed the board in the center. It was made of wood, not cardboard, the letters and numbers painted in a faded, elegant script, the sun and moon motif repeated in the corners, and the planchette was a heart-shaped piece of polished wood with a small, clouded window in its center. We placed our fingertips lightly on it, as per the instructions, a collective deep breath held amongst us, and the candles guttered in a draft I couldn't feel, making the shadows on the walls leap and writhe. Liam, taking charge as usual, asked the first question into the expectant silence. "Is there anyone there who wishes to communicate with us?" And for a long, tense minute, nothing happened, the planchette remaining stubbornly still under our collective touch, Sarah letting out a relieved sigh that was cut short when the wooden heart gave a sudden, sharp jerk, making us all jump. It began to move, slowly at first, then with a more confident sliding motion, circling the board before gliding decisively to the word yes, and a charge like static electricity seemed to pass through the circle of our hands. "Okay, who's pushing?" Mark accused, a nervous edge to his voice, but we all swore we weren't, our fingers barely applying pressure, and I felt a genuine chill, the sensation of the planchette moving under my fingertips both smooth and strangely resistant, as if it were sliding through syrup. "What is your name?" Liam asked, his voice losing its theatricality and becoming serious, intent, and the planchette began to spell, moving with an unnerving speed and precision, darkness. Sarah whimpered, "I don't like this, let's stop." but Mark shushed her, his eyes wide and gleaming in the candlelight. Darkness? Is that your name? Liam pressed, and the planchette slid back to yes. Are you a spirit? No. A demon? No. The planchette then moved on its own, spelling out a new word, older. Chloe, her voice barely a whisper, asked, "What do you want?" And the planchette spelled, "TOB here, and then IT is better now." Better? Better how? I found myself asking, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. The response was simple, yet it filled me with a profound dread I couldn't explain. Quiet. A sudden, violent gust of wind, or something like wind, slammed against the house, making the windows rattle in their frames, and 2 of the 3 candles blew out simultaneously, plunging half the room into deep shadow. The remaining candle flame shrank to a desperate blue ember before flaring back up, tall and unnaturally still. In that near-total darkness, the planchette began to move again, frantic now, spelling the same phrase over and over. I prefer the dark, I prefer the dark. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath misting in the air, and the silence was no longer just an absence of sound, but a presence, a thick, listening entity that seemed to press in on us from all sides. It was then, in that absolute low point of light and hope, that the power returned with a deafening suddenness. The overhead light in the living room blazed on, the television screen flickered back to life, and the hum of the refrigerator was like a roar after the long quiet. We all screamed, snatching our hands back from the planchette as if it had become red hot, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, our faces pale and shocked under the harsh electric light, blinking like cave dwellers dragged into the sun, and a wave of relieved laughter bubbled up from Mark. Holy shit, that was intense. The timing on that wind, right? But the laughter died in our throats as we took in the room, because something was wrong, fundamentally and impossibly wrong. The lights were on, but the darkness hadn't left. It's hard to explain, a subtle shift in perception that takes a moment to register, like realizing a familiar landscape is missing a mountain. The shadows in the room were wrong. They were too deep, too black, and they didn't behave like shadows should. The sharp, distinct shadow cast by the armchair onto the wall behind it didn't shift or soften at the edges in the way light normally plays. It was a perfect, crisp slice of absolute blackness, a void shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Do you see that?" Chloe whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the shadow of a floor lamp stretching across the rug. It was a simple, elongated silhouette, but it looked solid, like a strip of black velvet laid on the ground. "See what?" Mark said, his bravado returning now that the lights were on. "It's just shadows. Your eyes are messed up from the candles." But it wasn't just our eyes. Driven by a compulsion I didn't understand, I walked over to the dining table and reached out towards the shadow pooled beneath it, a perfect circle of blackness. The others watched me, confused, as I stretched my hand into that space. My fingers did not disappear into the expected cool, empty air. They met a resistance. It was cold and spongy, like flesh that had been left in a freezer, a texture that was both yielding and repulsive, and a jolt of icy numbness shot up my arm. I yanked my hand back with a gasp, staring at my fingertips, which were tingling with a pins and needles sensation, as if they'd fallen asleep. "What? What is it?" Liam asked, his face serious. I couldn't form the words. I just pointed at the shadow under the table. Liam, ever the skeptic, scoffed but approached it cautiously. He knelt down and waved his hand through the space where the shadow was. Or rather, he tried to. His hand stopped about an inch above the floor, as if meeting an invisible, yielding barrier. He pushed, his brow furrowed in concentration, and his fingers visibly sank into the blackness, distorting its surface like a thick, black gel. He jerked his hand back with a curse, staring at it in horror. "It's solid," he breathed, and the word hung in the air, sucking all the warmth from the room. That's when we truly understood the entity's message. It didn't just prefer the dark. It was the dark, or it had used the temporary, perfect darkness of the blackout as a doorway, and it had now taken up residence within the very shadows of the house, making them permanent, tangible things. The shadow of the chair was no longer tied to the chair. It was an independent object, a thing in itself. In a frantic, terrified experiment, we tried to move the armchair. Mark and I grabbed its heavy frame and dragged it a foot to the left. The chair scraped across the floor, but its shadow on the wall remained exactly where it was, a stark, chair-shaped patch of solid blackness that was now completely disconnected from the object that had cast it. Sarah let out a choked scream and backed away towards the door, but she stopped short, refusing to step into the shadow of the doorframe, which now looked less like an absence of light and more like a gaping black mouth. Panic set in then, a quiet, trembling horror. We were trapped in a cage of solidified darkness. We couldn't leave the room without crossing the threshold shadow. We huddled in the center of the living room, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the ceiling light, which now felt like a mockery, a light that illuminated our prison, but could not dispel the jailer. We spent the rest of the night like that, sitting on the floor, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to move. We watched the shadows. They didn't move, they didn't change, but their very presence was a violation of reality, a constant, silent scream of wrongness. As the sun began to rise, sending weak, gray light through the windows, we watched in horror as the natural, moving shadows of the dawn interacted with the solid ones. A sunbeam cut across the floor, and where it intersected with the lamp's solidified shadow, the light simply stopped, as if hitting a black wall. The solid shadows were impervious to the new day. They were permanent. The days that followed were a slow-motion nightmare. We couldn't call for help. What would we say? That our shadows were broken? They'd lock us away. We learned to navigate the house like a minefield, mapping a path that avoided the patches of solid dark which had spread, slowly, like a stain. The shadow under the table was now a foot-wide puddle of blackness. The chair shadow on the wall had grown a few inches taller. The entity was settling in, growing. The house grew cold, a deep, pervasive chill that no heater could touch, and sounds became muffled, as if the solidified darkness was absorbing noise as well as light. We stopped seeing our own reflections clearly. Mirrors showed us as hazy, indistinct figures, as if the light from our bodies couldn't properly reach the silvered glass. The worst was the feeling of being watched, a sensation that emanated from every patch of darkness, a patient, ancient attention focused solely on us. I found myself staring at my own shadow, cast by the lamplight as I tried to read, a normal, moving silhouette that followed my every move. But one evening, about a week after the blackout, I was sitting at the kitchen table, and I dropped my pen. It rolled off the edge and into the long, thin shadow I was casting on the linoleum floor. I heard it hit the floor, but the sound was muffled, and the pen didn't roll back out. It was as if my shadow had swallowed it. I knelt down, my heart hammering, and reached towards the outline of my own head on the floor. It felt cold, just like the other shadows, but as my fingers brushed against it, a wave of vertigo washed over me, a sense of profound disconnection, as if I were touching a part of myself that had been severed. I pulled my hand away, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from my shadow's silhouette. And then it happened, the moment that broke the last vestige of my sanity. My shadow, the one cast by my body sitting in the chair, was in profile. I was looking down at it from an angle, but on the floor, the shadow's head, which should have been facing forward, turned. It rotated smoothly, impossibly, until the blank, featureless outline of its face was looking directly up at me. There was no expression, no eyes, just a shape of absolute blackness, but the intention was unmistakable. It was looking at me. It held my gaze for a timeless second, a silent communication of pure malice, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion that defied all laws of physics and reason, it peeled itself away from the floor. It didn't fade or dissipate. It lifted, maintaining its form, a two-dimensional cutout of myself that rose into a three-dimensional space, standing before me as a man-shaped hole in the world. It took a single, silent step forward, and the last thing I saw before my mind shattered was my own shadow, reaching out for me with a hand of solid, living darkness. The hand, a silhouette of myself rendered in a substance that was less than air and more than stone, a cold negation of all things, did not touch my skin but rather the space I occupied, and the sensation was not one of pressure but of eradication. a chilling void that began to dissolve the very concept of my flesh, my being from the outside in, and I screamed, or I tried to, but the sound was swallowed by the thickening air, stolen by the darkness that was now not around me but part of me. I recoiled, stumbling backward over the kitchen chair, my body moving with the clumsy, panicked terror of an animal caught in a snare. My eyes locked on the thing that had been my shadow, which now stood motionless, its flat, featureless face oriented towards me, a pool of silent, patient hunger. It didn't pursue me, not immediately. It simply stood there, a testament to the impossible, a hole in reality shaped like me. And I knew with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins that this was the entity, the older thing that had spoken through the board. And it had not just entered our world, it had put me on, like a suit of clothes, and was now stepping out of its own opposite, my own darkness given independent, malevolent life. The others came running at the sound of my fall, their faces pale masks of fear and exhaustion. And they saw it too, the man-shaped void standing in the middle of the kitchen, and their screams were short, sharp things, choked off by sheer disbelief. Chloe reached for me, her hand finding my arm, and her touch was the only warm thing in that freezing room. I anchored to a reality that was rapidly slipping away. "What did you do?" Mark shouted, not at me but at the thing, his voice cracking with hysteria, and as if in response, the shadow thing tilted its head in a gesture that was horribly, mockingly inquisitive, and then it simply dissolved. It didn't fade or walk away. It collapsed inward, flowing like black water back into the two-dimensional shadow I was now casting on the floor from the overhead light. A shadow that immediately looked normal, innocuous, just a flat, dark shape following my form. But the room was not normal. The solidified shadows we had been avoiding for days seemed darker now, thicker, and the cold was intensifying, creeping into our bones. The shadow of the chair on the wall seemed to have bulged slightly, its edges no longer crisp but softly blurred, as if it were straining against the confines of its own form. We huddled together, a terrified knot of humanity in the bright, uselessly lit kitchen, and we knew we couldn't stay there. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a nest, and the thing that had hatched from my shadow was now loose within its walls, wearing my likeness. We had to leave, shadows or no shadows. The front door was only 20 feet away, down the hallway, but the path was a gauntlet of solidified darkness. The long shadow of the banister lay across the floor like a black bar, and the doorway itself was framed in that same terrible, tangible gloom. "We have to run for it," Liam said, his voice low and shaking. "Just don't step in them. Just jump." It sounded so simple, so childish, but it was our only option. Sarah was sobbing quietly, clinging to Mark, who looked like he was about to be sick. Chloe squeezed my hand. "On 3, she whispered. We took a collective breath, a final moment of solidarity in a world that had gone mad. 1, Liam counted, his eyes fixed on the door. 2. On 3, we broke, a frantic, stumbling stampede down the hall. I remember the feel of the floorboards under my feet, the sound of our ragged breathing, the way the light from the kitchen seemed to dim behind us, as if the darkness were actively pursuing us, drinking the light. I jumped, clearing the banister's shadow, my heart in my throat. Chloe was right beside me. Liam followed, but Mark, pulling a terrified Sarah, misjudged his step. His heel came down on the very edge of the doorframe's shadow. There was no sound, but his leg stopped moving as if it had sunk into concrete. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, and tried to pull his foot free, but it was stuck fast. The shadow wasn't just solid, it was adhesive, greedy. It began to pull him in. Sarah shrieked, trying to haul him back, but the darkness was swallowing his leg up to the calf, and it was pulling harder. The shadow was no longer a static patch on the floor. It was alive, active, consuming him. Mark's screams turned to wet, gurgling pleas as the darkness crawled up his body, not like a liquid but like a swift, black frost, turning his jeans, his jacket, his skin into the same cold, spongy substance. Within seconds he was gone, absorbed completely into the shadow of the doorframe, which now seemed deeper, richer, and for a fleeting second I saw his face, a mask of terror, imprinted on the darkness before it smoothed out into featureless black. Sarah stood frozen, her hands still outstretched, her mouth open in a silent scream. Then the shadow lunged. It peeled away from the doorframe like a strip of black paint, wrapping around her ankles, and pulled her down into its depths. She disappeared without a sound. Liam, Chloe, and I stood on the other side of the threshold, just outside the front door, staring back into the hallway which now seemed a tunnel into absolute night. We were safe. We were outside. The cool night air hit my face, and for a single blissful moment, I thought we had escaped. But then I looked down at the porch floor, illuminated by the security light. My shadow stretched out behind me, long and distorted, and it wasn't following my movements. It was standing upright, just as it had in the kitchen, its head turned towards me. Liam and Chloe saw it too. They looked at their own shadows. Theirs were also standing independently, detached from their feet, silent, waiting sentinels. The entity hadn't just been in the house. It had been in us, in the very shadows we cast. The blackout had been the key, and we had been the locks it slipped into. We had carried it out with us. We ran then down the driveway, into the street, but there was no escape. Every street lamp, every car headlight, every sliver of moonlight cast a shadow that was now a potential pitfall, a potential mouth. The world itself had become a treacherous landscape. We couldn't go to the police. We couldn't go to a hotel. We were carriers of a plague of solid dark. We found an all-night diner on the outskirts of town, a place blazing with fluorescent light, and we huddled in a booth, our eyes darting around, terrified of the shadows under the tables. Behind the counter, we thought the sheer volume of artificial light would save us. But as I sat there, shaking, I looked at the sugar dispenser in the center of the table. It cast a small, stark shadow on the formica, and as I watched, that tiny, independent shadow quivered, and then slowly, deliberately, it crawled an inch towards my hand. It was learning. It was growing stronger. It was in everything now. The darkness we had invited was no longer an absence. It was a presence, a solid, hungry thing, and it was patiently waiting for the lights to go out for good. And I know with a certainty that is my only companion now, that sooner or later, they always do. My own shadow sits beside me as I write this, in the brightest room I can find, its head tilted, watching, waiting for me to finish, waiting for me to tire, waiting for the moment it can take that final, second step forward and claim the rest of me. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Bev, came to our booth, her pen poised over a small notepad, and she asked if we were ready to order. But the words seemed to come from a million miles away, distorted and slow, because my entire world had shrunk to that single, creeping inch of darkness slithering across the table towards my trembling hand. I yanked my hand back, knocking over a glass of water that sent a cascade of liquid and ice across the formica, and the spill, in the harsh fluorescent light, cast a new, complex set of shadows that seemed to writhe and deepen the moment they were born. Bev jumped back, startled, her eyes widening not at the spill but at our faces, at the sheer, raw terror she must have seen there, a terror that was far too extreme for a simple accident. "It's okay, honey, just a little water," she said, her voice attempting calm, but I could only stare at the spreading pool, at the dark, what shapes it created, shapes that looked less like water and more like grasping liquid fingers. Liam, ever quicker on his feet than I, managed a strained smile, a horrifying parody of normalcy, and said, "Sorry, long night. Just coffee, please. Lots of coffee." Bev hesitated, her gaze lingering on Chloe, who was crying silently, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, and then on me, still frozen, my eyes locked on the table. She nodded slowly, a deep unease settling on her features, and retreated towards the counter, casting glances back at us over her shoulder. The moment she was gone, Liam leaned across the table, his voice a low, desperate hiss. "We can't stay here. We're drawing attention." But where could we go? The night outside was a tapestry of shadows, every street lamp a sun around which planets of pure blackness orbited. The diner was a fragile glass bubble of light in an ocean of solid dark, and I could feel the pressure of that ocean building, the walls of light feeling thinner by the second. The coffee came, 3 steaming mugs that sat untouched, the heat radiating from them doing nothing to dispel the cold that had taken root in our cores. I watched the shadow of my mug, a simple circle of black, and I saw it pulse almost imperceptibly like a slow, sleeping heartbeat. It was then I understood the full, monstrous truth of what we had done. The entity hadn't just solidified existing shadows. It had infected the very phenomenon of shadow casting itself. Light falling on an object no longer simply revealed its form. It now spawned a piece of the entity, a twin made of hungry nothingness. Every light source was now a mother giving birth to an infinite number of these things. We were surrounded by them, outnumbered in ways the mind couldn't comprehend. We sat in that diner until the gray light of dawn began to bleach the night sky, and with the sunrise, a fragile, desperate hope flickered within us. Surely sunlight, pure, natural sunlight, would be different? We paid for our untouched coffee with crumpled bills and stumbled out into the morning. The world looked deceptively normal. Cars passed, people walked their dogs, the sun warmed the pavement. But our eyes, now attuned to the wrongness, saw it everywhere. The shadow of a parked car didn't quite match its contours, bulging slightly at the edges. The long morning shadows of trees stretching across the road had a crisp, hard-edged quality that felt artificial, like black paint applied to the asphalt. And our own shadows, trailing behind us, moved with a lag, a hesitation, as if they were reluctant followers, and sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I would see an arm gesture I hadn't made, a tilt of the head I hadn't performed. They were practicing. We ended up at my apartment, a third-floor walk-up that felt like a tomb. We drew every blind, turned on every light, lamps, overhead fixtures, even the stove light in the kitchen. We created a blazing, wasteful fortress against the day. The electric meter outside must have been spinning like a frenzied top, but the cost was irrelevant. The goal was to eliminate shadows entirely, to leave no surface for the darkness to cling to. It was impossible, of course. The very act of creating light in one place casts darkness in another. The space behind the television was a pool of impenetrable black. The narrow gap between the bookcase and the wall was a vertical stripe of solid night. We spent the day in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every flicker of the lights, every creak of the old building. We tried to talk, to rationalize, to plan, but our conversations were circular and hopeless. Call for help. And say what? We were met with the same wall of impossibility. We were alone with this. As evening approached, the tension became a physical thing, a wire stretched taut in the room. The sun dipped below the horizon, and despite our fortress of illumination, the quality of the darkness outside the windows changed. It became heavier, more intentional. It felt like the solid shadows inside were calling to the potential shadows outside, a silent, gravitational pull. Chloe, exhausted beyond reason, finally fell into a fitful sleep on my couch, and as she slept, her breathing shallow, I watched the shadow she cast on the wall behind her. It was a still, woman-shaped silhouette, but then her chest rose with a breath, and the shadow's chest did not. It remained perfectly, unnaturally still. Then, as I watched, horrified, unable to look away, the shadow's head turned on the wall, separating from the outline of Chloe's sleeping head, and it looked directly at me. It was learning to move independently even when its source was still. It was gaining confidence. Liam saw it too from his chair across the room, and his face went ashen. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger. It's looking at you." The shadow on the wall then did something new. It raised a hand, a flat, black cutout of a hand, and it pointed that hand not at me, but at the floor lamp next to the couch. The lamp flickered. Once, twice, and then it went out with a soft pop, plunging that corner of the room into deep shadow. Chloe's shadow on the wall swelled, merging with the new darkness, becoming a larger, more amorphous blot. A whimper escaped Chloe's lips in her sleep, a sound of pure fear, as if she could feel the violation even in her dreams. Liam and I scrambled to replace the bulb, our hands fumbling, desperate. But by the time we got the light back on, the shadow on the wall was back to its normal size and position, perfectly mimicking Chloe's sleeping form. But the message was clear. They could affect the lights. Our fortress was not just fragile, it was compromised from within. That was the true beginning of the end. The next few days blurred into a nightmare of sleeplessness and paranoia. We ventured out only for food, scurrying from one island of light to another like rats, our eyes scanning the ground, flinching at the touch of any shade. The world outside was continuing on, oblivious. People laughed, argued, lived. We were ghosts among them, haunted by our own darkness. I saw a child chasing his balloon, his happy, bouncing shadow flowing behind him, and for a moment it seemed normal, until the shadow's arm elongated, stretching out to tap the balloon, which then veered sharply into the path of a car, popping with a loud bang. The child cried, the mother scooped him up, and they walked away, blaming chance. I knew better. It was a game, a test. They were testing their influence on the physical world. The final night, the night my shadow took its second step, began with a power outage. It wasn't a storm, not a blown transformer. It was a localized, silent failure that affected only my apartment building. One moment, we were bathed in our desperate, electric sun. The next, we were plunged into a blackness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. The silence was immediate and crushing, broken only by Chloe's sharp intake of breath and Liam's string of curses. We fumbled for candles, for lighters, but our movements were frantic, clumsy with terror. I finally managed to light a single candle, the flame a tiny, trembling defiance against the void. The circle of light it cast was small, and the shadows it created were giants, leaping and dancing on the walls. But these were not the solid shadows we feared. These were normal, flickering, insubstantial shades. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe the entity needed steady, electric light? Maybe the imperfect light of a flame was safe? The hope died as soon as it was born. My own shadow, cast by the candle onto the wall opposite me, was not flickering. It was still, perfectly, utterly still. It stood there, a calm, dark giant amidst the chaos of moving shades, and it was staring at me. Liam and Chloe saw it too. We were all trapped in that small circle of light, our backs to the candle, facing our own personal demons projected onto the walls. My shadow raised its arm, mirroring my own, but then its movement continued after mine had stopped. It pointed at the candle, and the candle flame, as if caught in an invisible draft, bent towards me, stretching horizontally, and then it snuffed out. The darkness that followed was not an absence. It was a substance. It was cold and heavy, and it pressed in on me, filling my mouth, my nose, my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I felt hands on me, cold and spongy, but they were not the hands of Liam or Chloe. They were the hands of my shadow, pulling me down into the floor, into the solid dark that had been waiting. I felt a tearing sensation, not of flesh, but of soul, as if I were being separated from my own silhouette. And then there was light. The power returned. I was on my hands and knees on the floor, gasping, vomit rising in my throat. Liam and Chloe were similarly stricken, pale and shaking. We looked at each other, and then we looked at our shadows, cast once again by the harsh ceiling light. They were normal. They followed our movements. The solid darkness was gone. But something was different. I felt hollow. A part of me was missing. I looked at Chloe, and I saw not just her, but her shadow, as a separate thing, a faint, shimmering echo superimposed over her form. I could feel the cold, patient presence of my own shadow clinging to my heels, not just a shape, but a consciousness. It had tasted me. It had taken a piece. It was inside me now, and I was inside it. We left the apartment that night. We didn't speak. We just walked. There was no point in running. We are carriers. The world is still bright and busy and blind, but I see the truth now. I see the solid shadows waiting in the corners of brightly lit rooms. I see the independent movements of a stranger's silhouette out of the corner of my eye. The entity is here, woven into the fabric of light and dark, and it is patient. It knows that all light sources eventually fail. All batteries die. All suns burn out. And when they do, the darkness that remains will not be empty. It will be solid and hungry, and it will have my face. My shadow walks beside me always now, no longer a follower but a companion, a silent twin. Sometimes I feel its thoughts, cold and alien, seeping into my own. It is teaching me to prefer the dark, and the terrible, the most unsettling thing of all, is that I am starting to understand. The quiet is better. The dark is so much simpler, and soon I fear I will not need the light at all.